I've not been to Texas before, and just 2 days ago I was at the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston. We had a big event there launching this book, and it was very rewarding for me because I spent so many weeks and months in the Kennedy Library doing the research for this book. But I was very much looking forward to the trip to Dallas, which I thus far have found to be a city full of wonderful people. Friendly, warm, delightful. I was in Austin last night, and I'm convinced that I'm going to have to come back and spend more time here. The museum is an incredible place, and for me to be here tonight and to give these remarks, to talk about this book in this setting, of course, is very moving to me. So thank you for being here and for joining me for this evening. I'm going to talk as little as possible because I want you to hear the voices of the letter writers. Some of them have been excerpted in the newspapers over the last few days. I would like to begin simply by telling you how I stumbled across this collection, which has been sitting in the Kennedy Library since the library was built. And apparently, occasionally people came in and would look for their letter. They remembered writing a condolence letter and they wanted to see it. The problem was that the letters are not organized by state, by name, by correspondent. My research and the ensuing interest in this project that seems to be considerable has led the archivist to begin doing more work on this collection. But just so you know, if you wrote a letter to Mrs. Kennedy, it might or might not be there, but there's really no way to find it. I can help them find now. Let me back up a little bit. I read the letters from Americans that still exist. And what happened is that there were so many of them. 7 weeks after the assassination, Mrs. Kennedy had already received 800,000 letters. There were, in a single day, 45,000 letters arrived at the White House. And by a year and a half or so, there were over 1.5 million letters. Now, in 1965, when decisions were being made about how to organize President Kennedy's library, the presidential libraries are all part of the National Archives system, as you know. The National Archives didn't feel that they had a good way of handling this volume of material. And so they pulped is the word, destroyed most of this collection. They saved all of the foreign mail, ironically. There were 80 boxes of foreign mail. And they saved VIP mail. Very boring, by the way. There are famous names at the bottom of very boring letters, was my read of it. That's kind of unfair. There are some that are interesting, and I put a few of them in the book, but mostly not terribly interesting compared to what so-called ordinary people wrote. They saved letters in which the person described a personal, they called them personal remembrances of an encounter with President Kennedy that are mentioned in a condolence letter. But they had a team of archivists who went through the collection and picked representative samples of the letters, and they wound up with, in the end, there were about 15,000 letters from Americans. That's the collection I focused on. Those are the letters that I read. I read them all. In addition to that, there are scattered condolence letters in the papers of Robert Kennedy. I read some of those, and in other collections in the Kennedy Library. But my focus was on what's called the general condolence mail. Now, one of the things the archivists did that was smart, they saved 3,000 letters, 3 big file boxes, literally jammed with letters of people, and these are unprocessed. The archivist, the chief archivist, was wonderful to give me access to these letters that had not been culled in any way, so that a scholar like me coming along could see what the inflow was like of letters before they had been, sort of sorted out. And those served as a control sample for me. It was hardly ideal, but it was better than nothing. And I read those letters. I found some wonderful letters in those boxes, by the way. And they allowed me to compare the culled collection to the raw data. And there was essentially no difference between the two. So that is what the collection looked like. I was going to the Kennedy Library to work on something completely different. And as part of that project, I wanted to get a sense of how people saw President Kennedy at the time of his death, before either all the hagiography that developed after his death, in which he was made into a saint and a martyr and, a sort of superhuman person, and then the ensuing almost 5 decades of revisionist history that has undone all of that, and in my mind, swung the pendulum too far in the other direction, so that younger people today, my students, don't understand what was it all about. Why were people so drawn in by John F. Kennedy? He wasn't president very long. He didn't seem to accomplish very much. What was the Kennedy phenomenon all about? And so I started thinking, what could I look at that might give me a sense of how Americans viewed him? And I asked the archivist if there was any condolence mail. I remembered this because my family sat and watched Mrs. Kennedy thank the nation for these letters. 7 weeks after the assassination, it was her first appearance on national television after the funeral. And I remembered this. It was in the brain pan. And I was driving down the Southeast Expressway towards the Kennedy Library. It was just like a cartoon, and this light bulb went off. And I thought, gee, now where do I start on this project? I'll ask about the condolence mail. I asked the archivist about it. Do you have the letters? He explained that most of them were destroyed. And I said, all of it? And he said, no, we have some. So I said, okay, could I see a box? And he brought up a box. I took out the first file folder, and one of the very first letters I looked at was written by a family of Eskimos in Alaska. And then I turned a couple of pages, and there was a letter from a coal mining family in West Virginia. And then the next letter was from Republicans who really disliked Kennedy. One woman said she was looking forward to voting against him in 1964 and was sorry she was going to be deprived of this opportunity. But in those letters, condolence letters to Mrs. Kennedy are like condolence letters. Most of you, judging by the age profile, have written a condolence letter. The goal is to console the bereaved person, to offer some reflections, and that's what these letters do. But within them, I quickly came to see there was much, much more. And what we could gain was a snapshot of the country, responding to a cataclysmic historical event at a specific moment in time, and they were tremendously, to my mind, revealing. So I became convinced that they needed to be brought to light. Oh, I was very enthusiastic about this. I went off to my colleagues, and I was on leave at the Radcliffe Institute, and I said, oh, I found this amazing collection at the Kennedy Library. I got to forget the other book. I'm going to do a new book. I want to publish these letters. But there's one hitch. I have to find these people. The copyright under U.S. copyright law resided with the letter writer. Even though the letters are in the National Archives, they belong to the American people, they belong most fundamentally to the person who wrote the letter or their heirs. And that, for a period, the copyright law, I think, has changed. Originally, I think it was 75 years. It may be 90 years now. So I was going to have to find these people if I wanted to publish their letter and ask their permission, or I was going to have to find their next of kin. Well, I was very cocky. I thought, no big deal, I'll find these folks. I badly underestimated what this was going to involve. By the end of this book, I had genealogists, a team of genealogists working with me to find people. And the genealogists were hiring genealogists. That was scary. In places like Dallas and going through city directories, and the tale of how we found people is fascinating, but I won't, digress too much on that. That's quite an amazing story. But we succeeded in the end. I found 3,000 out of the 15,000 letters that I thought were worthy of publication. I was pretty sure my publisher wasn't going to publish 3,000 letters. And so the really hard thing was to then get it down to 300 letters. And I got it down to 300, and then my editor was less enthusiastic about 25 of them, or 50, than I was. And in the end of the maybe 260 or so that I wanted to publish, or 240, we found all but 20 of the people and were able to gain permission. We were denied permission by, I think, 5 people out of everyone we contacted, and they all had very good reasons, which of course we honored. None of them had anything to do with their views of President Kennedy. They were all personal issues that I certainly understood. So that's how the book came to be, and it has been a remarkable project for me. There are many, many striking things about the collection, a lot of different things we could conclude from it. But I want to begin by talking a little bit. I'm going to read you some letters tonight that will give you a sense of the overall scope of the book. The book really begins with letters that talk about November 22nd and how people heard the news, how they responded to it, where they were at that moment, and how they reacted. And one of the things that is so striking about these letters is the incredible eloquence of these Americans who wrote in. There are many, one of my oldest friends is from Dallas, and when I told him I was starting this project, he said, well, you're not going to find many letters from Dallas in there. And I said, wrong. There were hundreds of letters from people in Dallas in the collection. And I want to begin with one of them. This letter, like many other letters in the collection, sometimes people wrote in to Mrs. Kennedy and they enclosed another letter. And this is one such example. Dear Mrs. Kennedy, the following letter is a copy of a letter that I wrote to a parish priest, Episcopal, who moved away from this area some time ago. I thought perhaps you would know by this letter that there are those who will never forget your husband and who will always miss him. Even now, 6 months afterward, unexpected tears spring to my eyes every time I see a film of him on television. Even now, it is so hard to believe. I whisper to myself, surely this can't be so. Your beautiful picture on the cover of Life and your article prompted me to write to you. I hope I have given you some comfort. And the letter writer encloses the letter that she wrote on November 27th, 1963, just 5 days after the assassination, to her priest. Dear Father, may I share a few thoughts with you about the tragedy? Nothing has touched me so deeply in a long time. I had seen President Kennedy just 3 or 4 minutes before he was shot. I had planned all week to go to the parade in downtown Dallas, but the morning dawned foggy, misty, and ugly. Billy insisted that I stay home and watch the motorcade on television, but by 9:30 a.m. I couldn't sit still any longer. I put on my oldest raincoat and overshoes and dashed to Dallas. I parked way down on Pacific and was the last car that lot could take. Excitement was in the air, and I was glad to be alone so that I could soak it up without the necessity of polite conversation with anyone. I walked slowly, trying to kill the long wait. Finally, I decided to go to Neiman's Zodiac Room for a snack, but they were having a private brunch until noon, so I sadly turned away. As I did so, I saw the beauty salon, and right there decided to get my hair cut. I was happily surprised that they could take me. I told them that I couldn't wait because I wanted to see the president. I'm going to excerpt some of this because it's quite a long letter. When I came out of Neiman's with my new haircut at 11:10, crowds were already forming. It was quite heartening because I had worried so about his reception in Dallas. The crowd grew and grew. Soon rooftops and awnings were crowded. Police cars made constant patrols, looking, watching. A police truck hauled off a car that was left on Main Street. The crowd was very jovial, and those of us who shared the long, foot-tiring wait became like neighbors. A young girl next to me had a transistor radio, and we were able to hear on-the-spot reporting about his wonderful welcome at Love Field, about his friendly handshaking, Jackie's beauty, and everything. The excitement was mounting. Finally, the police turned away all traffic, and Main Street was empty at noon. The police cautioned us to stay on the curb, but we couldn't resist dashing out into the quiet street for a long look to see if the motorcade was approaching. At last it came into view, and that first sight of it filled me with such incredible excitement that I don't believe I can describe it. Indeed, even to write of it starts my heart pounding. The first thing I was able to see at several blocks' distance were the red lights of the motorcycle police escort, about 8 flashing lights preceding the dark limousine. They were traveling faster than I had expected. The police were yelling to stay back, but from both sides of the street we surged out. I almost got my toe run over by one of the motorcycles. Long as I live, I will never forget Kennedy. Tanned, that was the first thing I noticed. Smiling, handsome, happy. I didn't get to see Jackie's face because she was waving to her side of the street, but her youthful image was unmistakably beautiful. Her long mahogany-colored hair was blowing in the wind, and the sun, which had come out brilliantly, caught the red highlights. I'll always remember the way that it shone so brightly on the president. Then they were gone. I was shaking so as I made my way back to the parking lot that I decided I better stop. I got into my little Opel and turned on my radio, and the first thing I heard was, "The president has been shot." And I just thought that the announcer had meant to say that the president has been shocked at the size and friendliness of the crowd. All too soon, the terrible truth sunk in, and I don't know how I got home. I couldn't go into my house alone, so I went to a neighbor's. One of my neighbors had attended the breakfast in Fort Worth that morning. Needless to say, I never did eat lunch or supper. I never made a bed, got together a meal, nor paid a bill until after the funeral. I even almost forgot that my beloved mother had died on November 24th and was buried on Billy's birthday. Today is my own birthday, and it means nothing to me. I am sick, and violently angry. Pray for us all, please. The author of this letter, Janice Crabtree, is here with us tonight, sitting over here. Janice, will you stand, please? Well, you can imagine when I read that letter, this was, as much as we have read and heard about the Kennedy assassination, this vivid, beautifully described account was so powerful and moving. And when we finally found Janice, and I have to add, this was not easy. It was by way of Wyoming, I think. Montana, through her son. But we found our way back to Grapevine, and I had a wonderful conversation with her, and am so grateful to have the letter in the book. There were many people who were on the motorcade route who wrote in. I'd like to read another such letter. Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I know the grief you bear. I bear that same grief. I am a Dallasite. I saw you yesterday. I hope to see you again. I saw Mr. Kennedy yesterday. I'll never see him again. I'm very disturbed because I saw him a mere 2 minutes before the fatal shot was fired. I couldn't believe it when I heard it over the radio 5 minutes later. I felt like I was in a daze. To Dallas, time has halted. Everyone is shocked and disturbed. My prayers to you, a sympathetic, prayerful and disturbed Dallasite, Tommy Smith, age 14. He's a little bit older now. Tommy Smith is right here. I wish I could tell you that I'm going to introduce every one of these letter writers to you, but alas, many of them have passed away. But I have been very grateful to meet people as I've traveled around to different cities talking about the book. This is an extraordinary letter, not from Texas, but gives you some sense of how profoundly shocking this event was. Dear Mrs. Kennedy, may I extend my heartfelt sympathy and prayers to you and your family. I do so admire your courage and strength. It has been an inspiration to me, the way you have conducted yourself. You see, Mrs. Kennedy, my husband died of a heart attack while sitting at the table drinking a glass of milk on Friday, November 22nd, at about the same time your husband and our beloved president was killed. We were listening to the news about your husband when my husband had his attack. His last words were, "How could anyone have such hate in his heart that he could do such a thing to our president?" My 16-year-old son came in at that time from school and was with me when he died. He died not knowing for sure the president was dead. My husband was 46 years old, born in April 1917. My prayers will be with you and your family in the difficult days ahead. I can truly sympathize with you, as I am going through the same adjustment, that of adjusting your life with the man, without the man you love by your side. It was amazing to see the age range of letter writers in the collection. There were letters from children as young as 7 years old. And then I came across this letter. Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I want to express my sympathy in your great loss and in this trying hour of our nation. It is with sorrow, I have to say, that I have seen all 4 of our presidents assassinated. As I celebrated my 99th birthday, November 22nd. It certainly was a very sad evening for me, as well as all West Virginians. We had learned to love the president, as he was so interested in our state. The nation has lost a great leader. May God bless you and the children is my prayer. One thing that I do discuss in the book a little bit is the sense of guilt that many Americans felt about the assassination. It's been fascinating to me over the last 24 hours just talking to various people in Dallas and hearing their memories of this event. And the way that we were talking today, why did the stigma get attached to Dallas when it seemed not to have been attached to Los Angeles, where Robert Kennedy was assassinated, to Memphis necessarily, where Martin Luther King died? And yet in Dallas, there was certainly a feeling among many letter writers that they were themselves ashamed, and they felt very strongly that people in Dallas would be blamed. One letter from a woman in Midland predicted, most persons outside the state will bitterly feel that it could have only happened in Texas. But in fact, from reading these letters, that feeling was widely shared, a sense of shame across the nation. And in strange ways, people felt they tried to get a hold of this event by looking at their own lives, a variety of causal factors. One man wrote, I feel in some way I could have been somewhat at fault. Each night I used to pray for your husband to protect us with God's help. Last night I stayed out late, went to bed without saying my prayer. When I heard this about our great leader, I was so sorry I did not pray. This I will never do again. God help me. But the sense of acute responsibility that many folks in Dallas and throughout Texas felt comes across very clearly in the letters. My dear Mrs. Kennedy, I have never written to a congressman, president, or any type of statesman. In fact, in my 30 years of living, I've never done much of anything except vote towards being an American or making this country a better place in which to live. Today, however, my heart is so heavy, I feel I must express myself to you. I feel I must tell you how very ashamed I am to be living in this city, Dallas, a city of cultural background, a city of colleges, schools, and supposedly intelligent people. God would that I could move from this place this hour. I happened to be downtown this noon and took the time from my work to stand on the street to take a look at a man and a woman that I have loved for 3 years. I am so glad now that I did, for never in my life have I admired and respected a man more than I did John F. Kennedy. In my opinion, he was one of the most outstanding individuals that this country has been able to produce in hundreds of years. All of this means nothing to you now, I am sure of that, but, my dear lady, I was moved to tell you that there are those of us in this terrible city of ours who loved your husband very much. We have cried, literally, bitter tears over this day. May God forgive those who brought this shame to our city and to our country. I would like to extend to you, Mrs. Kennedy, to your family, the most sincere and heartfelt sorrow that is felt by me, my mother, and many thousands of others in this land. I only wish it were possible for a humble small person such as I to bring this message of sympathy to you in person. There was a letter, many letters from young people in the collection. One from the Youth for Kennedy Johnson from Austin, Texas, dated November 25th. Dear Mrs. Kennedy, there are no words in any language to express truly our grief and the sympathy we wish to extend to you and your family on the death of your husband, the President. We Texans pride ourselves in our state, and that such a perverted act would happen here doubles the weight of grief in our hearts. We in this organization have our own personal sorrows too, for we hold a seemingly stronger bond to Mr. Kennedy than others. Here in Texas, here in our city, the sunsets are blood red and the streets flow with tears. The only sound heard is that of crystal silence, rippled occasionally by a single bell that tolls a solemn requiem for our President John F. Kennedy. Our prayers are with you, your small children, the other members of your family, and also the deepest hope that somewhere in your private heart you can find that enabling you to forgive the twisted mind, to forgive Texas, and to forgive us, the nation. In deepest sympathy, the Youth for Kennedy Johnson, Marcy Wentworth, Deputy Corresponding Secretary. There are many, 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 many letters, and I could keep you here all night and won't. You'll be relieved to know. Obviously, I have a, insatiable appetite for reading these things, as I did. One of the amazing letters in the collection was written by a young man in the military who was in the Military Honor Guard that was very involved in President Kennedy's funeral. And he was on duty when he got the news that they were being called up, that something big had happened. And he wrote a letter to his sister, who then sent this along to Mrs. Kennedy. And he said, on the 22nd of this month, we were out in the cemetery having funerals. We got back at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. While we were getting off the bus, I noticed there were about 25 or 30 guys standing around in the back, gathered around a radio. I knew something was wrong, so I went over and asked what was going on. One guy turned around and said, "They say our boy Johnny has been shot." But I didn't believe it. I ran in and turned my weapon in and went upstairs, got my radio, sat down, and listened. The word came down from headquarters that we would be on 72-hour ceremonial alert. So we had to get our dress blues ready and stand by, ready to move. Saturday, November 23rd, the whole battalion went on parade field, and the battalion commander read the presidential death order to us. It's really odd, but it was pouring down rain, and no one said a word about it. No one seemed to even notice the rain or even the fact that we were all getting soaked. We weren't wearing raincoats either. Then suddenly, on Sunday, November 24th, we got our orders to move down to the Capitol building where we were going to move the late president's body for the people of this nation. I was standing right at the top of the steps where they took the body. As the casket came up the steps, Mrs. Kennedy and her 2 children immediately followed it. Then came the heads of our government. As Mrs. Kennedy reached the top step, she turned and looked over my shoulder to the cameras. She hesitated on the top step, then gave a faint smile, as to say, "Thank you, Americans, for the feeling and understanding." This may sound silly, but I got a lump in my throat. After the ceremony, we came back. But this is the really touching part of the whole thing. It was really cold, but people from where, I don't know, came into the rotunda all night long until 10 a.m. Monday. And as cold as it was, they waited in line 9 and 10 hours, waiting, shivering, but devoted to seeing their great leader one more time. Also, people slept by the thousands in lines and sleeping bags all night long along the route to Arlington National Cemetery, where he would travel the next day at 1 p.m. After the ceremony, we went to eat, and then we went to the cemetery, and I was posted right below the gravesite. We waited down there for about 2 hours. I think you know that in all our ceremonies, we either stand at parade rest or at attention. We were standing at parade rest. When the colors and the casket came by, I was so numb, I couldn't complete a present arms. I couldn't move. Oh, I wish you could have seen the funeral and heard it also. We could hear them coming across the Lincoln Memorial Bridge. Those drums were beating a death march. They were really beautiful. I guess that's about all, except for the feeling of the people. Honestly, it was enough to bring tears to your eyes. We were watching the people. They were walking along, and then suddenly they just fell on their knees and prayed right on the spot, in the streets, along the sidewalks and parks, everywhere. You should have seen the people. It finally totaled well over 1 million. The streets were packed 30 or 40 deep, and across the bridge they were 20 deep. This was on both sides. And at the cemetery there were ropes around the grave, about 200 feet all the way around. They were packed all the way around 1,000 deep. Well, it is one of the most tragic things that has happened in this country. Would you please save this letter for me? It's like a diary. Then I can remember how I felt and what I did. I think I'll read you one more. I have focused, I'm afraid, because of on the first part of this book, but the second part really talks about how Americans saw President Kennedy. There are a lot of letters from African Americans, from poor people, from people from every walk of life, discussions about civil rights, about the role of the presidency, and then in the end, some letters about grief and loss. I will get to 1 or 2 of those. One of the letters that, to use the expression, blew my mind was this. This letter I thought was so eloquent that when I got to the final paragraph, I was staggered by this. Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I wish to extend to you and the children my condolences. Children increase the cares of life, but they do help to mitigate the remembrance of death. We are told that a good key is necessary to enter paradise. The President, following the guidelines of his church, possessed this key. Heaven, it seems, calls its favorites early. In the President, I felt I had known a whole man. It is a rare experience, but always an illuminating and ennobling one. It costs so much to be a full human being that there are very few who have the enlightenment or the courage to pay the price. The lights of the prison have gone out now. In this, the quiet time, I can't help but feel that my thoughts and the thoughts of my countrymen will ever reach out to that light on an Arlington hillside for sustenance. How far that little light throws his beam. Sincerely, Stephen J. Hanrahan, 85255, Federal Penitentiary, Atlanta, Georgia. There are many, many letters in the collection from children, and I wanted to end with this one, appropriately from Houston. It's dated December 6, 1963. Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I am 10 years old. When I saw them moving President Kennedy's rocking chairs out of the White House, a great sadness entered my heart. You made such a beautiful collection of treasures from other presidents of the United States. Do you think you could find it in your heart to leave one of President Kennedy's rockers for children my age to remember him by? I will always remember him laughing and talking with touring children and dignitaries alike, seated in his rocking chair. And most of all, I remember his solemn and determined look as he sat pondering the terrible decision he must make in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Someday I hope to visit our beautiful White House and see all the wonderful treasures you have collected from presidents of past generations. But please leave this one personal treasure of a young president of our generation, so that one day I may run my hand over the wooden arms and borrow for a moment a little of the courage and vigor of this, our youthful 35th President of the United States of America. May our Lord's birthday and the new year bring peace and comfort to you, Caroline, and little John. Respectfully, Susan Lane. So, my final point to you tonight about these letters is to say this. The founders of our country thought that a democracy would work against all of the ancient philosophers and political analysts of their time who worried that a democracy would deteriorate into anarchy. They believed otherwise because they thought that there was wisdom and virtue in the people, and that we could trust the greatest decisions to be made by common folk. And what you see in this collection of letters is the compassion, the sincerity, the decency of the American people, across all their divisions, across race, across religion, across political belief, expressing their own heartfelt sentiments very powerfully, very thoughtfully. And as sad as all of this is, what we can take away from it is that there is in the core of our country this extraordinary resource, the people themselves. So I end on that note. Thank you so much for coming and for your interest in this book. I'm happy to take any questions if I haven't exhausted you all. Sure.
While you were reading these letters, were there any breakdown and cry moments?
For me?
For you?
Yeah, I think I shed a few tears. I was very saddened by the number of letters from children and parents, children who had lost parents, the final section of the book are letters having to do with grief and loss. And there were many, many letters from children who had lost parents. One of them said that she lost her father, her grandfather, and then her father, and then John F. Kennedy became her main man, and now he had died as well. And letters from parents who had lost children. So people who had experienced these profound losses. And there's one letter from a guy named Norbert Hurl, who we found his daughter, and it's very short. It's a line or two, and he says, I too have experienced a terrible loss. I'm paraphrasing. My little girl drowned. It takes more courage to live than to die. And he was just talking about, the struggle to go forward. So I was very, very touched by these letters. They were just extremely moving to me.
One hears a lot about the more cynical nature of our society today. If, let's say, President Barack Obama were assassinated, do you think the outpouring would be the same, or we do really colder and more cynical today than we were in 1963?
I'm afraid that I have to say that I think we are, I wouldn't say more cynical. We're older, a lot of us anyway. And I think there was something about this event that made us older. There's one wonderful letter in which a little girl says, a young girl says, they say that you're not grown up until you lose someone you love. I grew up on November 22nd. So there was a sense of a loss of innocence about this event. And because of the subsequent violence in our society through the 1960s, through its wars and all that we've experienced since, there had been terrible violence prior to this, of course, the worst World War. And there are many letters in here from veterans and Holocaust survivors and others who had seen terrible, terrible things. A letter from a Holocaust survivor who says that he saw murders, shootings, hangings every day, starvation, and that nothing had affected him as profoundly as the death of President Kennedy. So there was something about this event that was very searing. And having lived through that, I'm not sure that the generation that did they would be horrified, they would write heartfelt letters, but would they be profoundly shocked? Yes, and, perhaps no. So it's a long-winded answer to say that I think there was a loss of innocence in some sense here. And in no way am I trying to romanticize the early 1960s. This is the age of segregation. There are many descriptions of terrible violence in this society. But at this level, an attack upon the president, it was unthinkable in a ghastly way. And the man who had been the first television president, who people felt they knew very intimately because of television and the following of this youthful first family. Anyone else? Have I staggered you into silence? Sir.
What was the most challenging part?
The whole book took about a year to do, but I was working round the clock on it. I became extremely involved, and I was up till all kinds of strange hours and really deeply committed to it. Once I got going, I was just very passionate about it. The hardest thing was finding the letter writers. I was way overconfident about that, way overconfident. And by the end, we lost a few letters from people that had such common names that we just couldn't find them. And we were doing everything. We had people going in apartment buildings they had lived in and knocking on every door to say, "Do you remember Dorothy Smith?" By the way, if anyone knows Dorothy Smith from Dallas, let me know. I really wanted that letter and I couldn't get it. So that was very, very challenging. But it was also incredibly rewarding, because when you found the person on the other end of it, I am somebody who was afraid to ring the doorbell of my friend's house when I was a little kid. I just waited for them to come out. So here I was going to start hunting these people down all over the country. So there's a wonderful letter at the end of the book from a woman who says, Mrs. Kennedy, I know you're getting all these letters. I think you should put them in a book so that Americans will one day be able to read and understand what the president meant to the country. So I decided I would start with her, because if she didn't give me permission to publish that letter, there wasn't going to be a book. So I found her easily. She was living in the house that she lived in 1963. And I explained who I was. I said, I'm a historian. I said, do you recollect? I think I have a letter that you wrote to Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy in 1963. Do you remember writing such a letter? And she said, was it after he died? And I said, yes. And she said, yes, I do remember. And I said I was looking for permission to publish it. And I was completely unprepared for what happened next. She said, would you read me the letter? Made sense. She wasn't going to let me publish it without knowing what she said. So I read the letter, and she began crying when she heard her words back. And she said, no death ever affected me as much in my life as this one. That should never have happened to that man. And when I asked her if I could publish it, and she said, yes, I would do anything for him. It was interesting that so many letter writers, despite all we learned about President Kennedy, he was not the model husband and, all the other things we could go into, virtually none of them had changed their views of President Kennedy over the 5 ensuing decades, despite all of this. And I found that quite remarkable. Anyone else?
Did you read many of the letters you talked about that weren't from Americans? And if so, how were they? How did the world react compared to the United States? This was an international phenomenon. There are letters from every corner of the globe. Many of them are in the language of the country from whence they come. I did read some of them. And I quickly became convinced that the copyright issues I was dealing with for Americans, that finding these folks was way beyond my capacities, and I was going to leave that to someone smarter than I was to deal with the foreign mail. And I felt that it would be diluting the project in a way that was going to make it impossible for me to complete. But they are extremely powerful. And I recently heard from a colleague of mine at the University of New Hampshire. He's involved in an exchange program with Denmark. And a Danish friend of his came to the Kennedy Library, was doing research on something else, and he read the condolence letters from Denmark. And he called my colleague and he said, not knowing about my book, I found these amazing letters at the Kennedy Library from these Danes. They're from fishermen in tiny villages in Denmark who were writing to Jacqueline Kennedy. And he was describing precisely this phenomenon of these so-called little ordinary people and this outpouring of grief. So this is a very rich collection, I'm sure, and I hope that this study will inspire other people more talented than I to go into some of those boxes as well. Yes? Well, that's a wonderful question, and it's one that I've thought about a lot. And one of the things that I walked away from this thinking, I was very sobered, by the number of people who talked about the extremism and divisions in the country, which they felt had created a climate that had encouraged someone who was crazy to take this step and to kill the president.
And that was disturbing to me. In fact, if you'll bear with me, I want to give you a sample of that. I actually marked it to read to you. And then one always has to gauge the stamina of one's audience, and I felt like I was pushing my luck here. But I want to see if I can... and I marked it partly to show you that the Dallas reaction was a national one. This is quite an amazing thing. Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I feel that I too must join the chorus of sympathy that has been showered upon you in regards to your husband. You must not grieve, great lady, because that is the job of our country. The world may be divided into vast empires, cities split in half, countries fighting against themselves, and neighbors killing each other, but all men of every race, color, and creed came to give you something. It may not be a gift that can be seen, but one that you can feel in your heart. The reason that all men mourn the death of your husband is because we feel that we have played a part in his murder. We may not have been there or even known that you were there, but we were all responsible because we did not fight with him in everything he stood for. We just sat back and watched. We have wasted a great man. We may not realize that fault now, but in time, history will write its own story on blood-filled pages. We all feel the loss of him, dear lady, and I, as one, am sorry. I found these reactions very sobering, given the divisions in our country today. That was one reaction. The other one is that there's a lot of criticism today of, you know, all of this talk about hope and change and what does it really add up to. But one of the lasting legacies of President Kennedy, I think, that comes through in these letters was the way in which part of presidential leadership is inspiring hope, putting a positive valence on change, and really making the American people feel a sense of coherence and a sense that part of one's service to the country involves sacrifice. I'm not sure that that phrase, ask not, you know, what you can, do for your country, would necessarily go over as well today. I'm garbling this in my fatigue, but, so the emphasis on selflessness, on service, the idealism, for all of his faults, it's clear that Americans responded very powerfully to that, and that it galvanized several generations. And even if he himself didn't live up always to the moral values that he stressed for the nation, they were valuable things to have endorsed. And, this is very clear on the civil rights issue, where historians are very critical of Kennedy, and yet so many African Americans were so powerfully moved by having a president stand up and say, we have to do this because it is right. There's a moral crisis facing the nation. And that changed people's lives. It changed how they felt about themselves. It was empowering. So that's an element of presidential leadership too. And I think it was something that John F. Kennedy did very, very well. Yes. I have not. And, as you probably know, the Kennedy family doesn't talk about the assassination. They don't choose to commemorate it in any way. And what I did do, however, was to go to the director of the Kennedy Library. These documents belong to the American people. They're in the National Archives. They're open to researchers. I was free to do this book without asking anyone's permission. But it seemed to me that it would be the right thing to do to go to the director of the library and tell him that I hope to do this book. He did speak to the board of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation and informed them of the project, and no objection was raised. And that's what I can tell you. Yes. Yes, I did. I began to feel that maybe I had been reading more of them, however. By the end of the whole project, I had been through so many thousands of letters. And one of the things about Mrs. Kennedy that came through to me as I did this project was thinking that she was 34 years old when this event occurred. She was sitting 6 inches away from her husband when he was killed. She came that close to being killed herself. She, in a matter of days, had gone from being the First Lady to having to move out of the White House and start a life over with 2 small children. And I had a wonderful interview with her secretary, who really did not want to talk to me, but was gracious about answering a few questions about the condolence mail. And I think that we should take away from it what Mrs. Kennedy herself told the public, which was that she read the letters as she could bear to. In the archives, there are 1 or 2 letters that were answered personally by Mrs. Kennedy's secretary. And one of them is an extraordinary letter from a little boy whose picture is in the book. He's sent in a picture of himself in his Cub Scout uniform saluting. And it begins by saying, "In September of 1962, some mean men killed my daddy here in Dallas, too. He was a soldier. Santa Claus didn't get my letter. I asked him for a bicycle. Would you let him know that I want a bicycle," or something to this effect. Sincerely, Monroe Young III. And I found attached to Monroe Young's letter, and on the back of his picture, he put his date of birth, a letter from Mrs. Kennedy's secretary that says, "Mrs. Kennedy appreciates your letter." It was a personal letter. It wasn't just one of these cards. She notes that your birthday is coming up and wishes you a very happy birthday. But really, other than that, and 1 or 2 other such indications, that's all we really have to go on. Anything else? Well, thank you very much for your time and your patience.